You exhibited threatening behavior, and that's unacceptable. It's factual. That's
Not true. I was just defending myself.
Let's work through this together. You can do this.
Okay.
The air in the corridor was significantly cooler than the classroom, recycled through vents that hummed with a low, monotonous drone, smelling faintly of industrial citrus cleaner and floor wax. I closed the heavy oak door behind me with a softness that required deliberate, agonizing muscle control. Slamming it would have been a declaration of war. Letting the latch click too loudly would have been interpreted as a microaggression. Even the way I released the brass handle was a calculated performance of compliance. This is the invisible curriculum I had been studying since I was tall enough to look an adult in the eye. I adjusted the strap of my backpack, feeling the heavy physics textbook digging into my shoulder, a tangible reminder of the honors student status that was supposed to protect me. It did not. As I began the long walk toward the administrative wing, the silence of the empty hallway felt heavy, like the barometric pressure drop before a violent thunderstorm. I was not merely walking to the principal's office to discuss a misunderstanding. I was walking through a psychological minefield where my silence was being weaponized against me, and my height was being cited as evidence of intent. This moment, right here in the vacuum between the accusation and the adjudication, is where the real story lives. It is where the tax is collected. To understand why I did not shout, why I did not throw my hands up in exasperation, and why I eventually walked away with the district apologizing to me, you have to understand the concept of the black tax. It is not financial. It is an emotional tariff levied on your existence. It is the extra energy required to prove you are innocent before you have even been accused. It is the requirement to be twice as calm to be considered half as rational. In that hallway, under the flickering fluorescent lights, I was paying it in full. The accusation of threatening behavior was not based on a threat I made. It was based on the fear she felt. And in this system, her fear is treated as an objective fact, while my reality is treated as a subjective debate. Every tile on that floor seemed to stretch the distance between me and my future. As I walked, I thought about the words Mrs. Gable had used. Threatening. Aggressive. These are words that function as trapdoors. Once opened, you fall into a narrative that was written long before you were born. This is the tension that underscores every interaction I have in this building. If I raise my hand too quickly, is it enthusiasm or aggression? If I question a grade, is it academic curiosity or insubordination? The black tax is the exhaustion of constantly managing the emotions of the people around you to ensure they remain comfortable enough to let you exist. It is the exhausting, high-wire act of diplomacy performed by teenagers who just want to learn calculus. But today, the tax had become too high. Today, the cost of doing business in this school was my dignity, and that was a price I was no longer willing to pay. I knew that when I reached the end of this hall, I would be facing a tribunal that was predisposed to believe the teacher. The hierarchy of credibility always tilts upward. To them, she was the authority, and I was the variable. But they did not know about the three things I had in my pocket. Not physical objects, but three distinct pillars of defense that I had been building for years. This is the open loop of our story, the roadmap you need to understand before we get to the camera footage that vindicated me. You cannot appreciate the checkmate unless you understand the opening gambit. Over the next 45 minutes, I am going to unravel this incident not just as a singular event, but as a convergence of three specific lessons. We are going to explore the code of excellence, a strategy instilled in me by my father, which dictates that your work must be so undeniable that it serves as armor. We are going to look at the art of translation, or what sociologists call code switching, and how I used their own bureaucratic language to dismantle their arguments. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we will revisit the ghost of 1968, the lessons from a mentor named Mr. Davis who taught me that history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. These three elements are the keys to understanding how a student stands up to an institution without raising his voice. Because if I had raised my voice, even by a decibel, the camera footage wouldn't have mattered. The narrative would have shifted to my reaction rather than her action. That is the trap. The system waits for you to react so it can justify the initial injustice. By keeping my heart rate down and my face neutral, I was denying them the ammunition they needed. I was starving the beast. The hallway finally opened up into the atrium, a vast, glass-walled space that showcased the suburban manicured lawns outside. It looked like freedom, but I was still inside the fishbowl. I could see the secretary behind the glass partition of the main office, her head bent over a computer, typing away at someone else's fate. I wondered if she was already typing up my suspension form. The presumption of guilt is a heavy coat to wear, especially in the summer. I stopped for a moment at the water fountain, not because I was thirsty, but because I needed a moment to calibrate. This is part of the tax as well, the constant need to strategize your own behavior. I took a sip of lukewarm water and looked at my reflection in the trophy case glass opposite the fountain. I saw a young man who was tired. I saw a young man who was angry. But mostly, I saw a young man who was prepared. The anger I felt was not the hot, explosive kind that burns you out. It was the cold, hard kind that sharpens your focus. It was the fuel that would power the engine of my defense. I knew that the moment I walked into that office, the timer would start. I had to be perfect. One slip of the tongue, one roll of the eye, one sigh of frustration, and the label would stick. I thought about the thousands of students who had walked this path before me. The ones who didn't have the language to defend themselves. The ones who got angry because they had every right to be angry, and were punished for it. I was walking for them too. This is the burden of the counter-narrative. You are never just yourself. You are a representative. If I failed in that office, I wasn't just failing myself. I was validating every stereotype they held about boys who looked like me. That is the black tax at its most insidious level. The removal of individuality. You become a monolith. You become a statistic. But I refused to be a statistic. I had the receipts. I had the timeline. And I knew something they didn't. I knew that the hallway camera, the one specifically installed to monitor us, had a wide-angle lens that covered the doorway of room 302. They installed it to catch us doing something wrong. They never expected it would be the tool that proved we were doing something right. As I approached the double doors of the administration office, the hum of the air conditioning seemed to get louder, drowning out the ambient noise of the school. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. It was a war drum, but only I could hear it. I checked my watch. 10:14 a.m. The incident had happened at 10:08 a.m. 6 minutes. In 6 minutes, my entire academic trajectory had been placed on the chopping block. It takes a lifetime to build a reputation and 6 minutes to dismantle it. But it also takes only a few seconds of truth to shine a light so bright that the shadows have nowhere to hide. I reached for the handle of the office door. The metal was cold. I took a deep breath, inhaling the sterile air, and prepared to enter the lion's den. I wasn't going in there to beg for mercy. I was going in there to demand consistency. I was going in there to audit the tax. The receptionist looked up as I entered. Her eyes went to the pass in my hand, then to my face. I could see the micro-calculations happening behind her glasses. She knew who I was. She knew why I was there. News travels fast in the ecosystem of a high school. The way she shifted in her chair, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, told me everything. She was uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort is often the first sign that the status quo is being challenged. I approached the desk, placing the pass gently on the laminated surface. I did not toss it. I did not slide it. I placed it. Every movement was a curated exhibit of non-aggression. Principal Skinner is expecting you, she said, her voice tight. I nodded once. Thank you, Mrs. Higgins. Politeness is the best armor. It confuses the enemy. It disrupts the expectation of hostility. I sat down in one of the hard plastic chairs to wait. The clock on the wall ticked with an aggressive loudness. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Each second was a deduction from my patience, but I hoarded my patience like gold. While I sat there, I replayed the tape in my head. Not the digital tape that would eventually save me, but the memory tape. I analyzed Mrs. Gable's body language. The way she had recoiled when I simply stood up to hand in my paper. The way her voice had pitched up an octave, signaling distress to the class before I had even spoken. She had weaponized her fragility. She had turned her own anxiety into a disciplinary infraction for me. It was a masterclass in projection. And now, I was sitting in the purgatory of the front office, waiting to answer for her insecurities. The injustice of it tasted metallic in my mouth. But I swallowed it. I swallowed it because I had a plan. I had the 3 pillars. And I was about to introduce Principal Skinner to a new way of doing business. This series isn't just about a camera. Cameras are just tools. This series is about the intelligence required to make the camera matter. It is about the preparation that happens in the dark so that you can stand in the light. Over the next few episodes, we will dissect the anatomy of an accusation. We will break down the mechanics of institutional bias not with buzzwords, but with cold, hard logic. You will see how the threat was constructed out of thin air, and how the behavior was nothing more than existence. But before we get to the resolution, we must sit in this tension. You must feel what I felt in that chair. The uncertainty, the weight, the isolation. Because only by understanding the weight of the black tax can you truly appreciate the strength required to lift it. The door to the inner office opened. Principal Skinner stood there, his tie slightly askew, his face a mask of serious administrative concern. "Come on in," he said. He didn't smile. I stood up, smoothed the front of my shirt, and walked past him. The game had begun. The air inside Principal Skinner's office was stale, recycled through vents that likely hadn't been cleaned since the building was constructed in the late 70s. It smelled of lemon polish and anxiety. I took the seat he offered, a low plastic chair that forced my knees up slightly higher than my hips, a subtle architectural choice designed to make students feel small before a word was even spoken. Across the mahogany expanse of his desk, Skinner settled into his leather executive chair, the kind that squeaked with authority every time he shifted his weight. To his right sat Mr. Henderson, the history teacher who had sent me here. Henderson refused to look at me. He was studying the spine of a binder on the bookshelf, his jaw set tight, his face flushed with a self-righteous indignation that I had seen too many times before. This was the tableau of judgment. 2 men, one carrying the weight of the institution, the other carrying a bruised ego, and me, the variable that needed to be solved. I folded my hands in my lap, interlocking my fingers to stop them from trembling. Not from fear, but from a precise, calculated rage that I could not allow to surface. Skinner cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to signal the official commencement of hostilities. He picked up a single sheet of paper, the disciplinary referral, and adjusted his glasses. I knew what was coming. I had spent my entire academic career building a fortress against this exact moment. This is what we call the defense of excellence. It is the belief, however naive, that if you are perfect, if you are undeniable, if you check every box and cross every T, you will be immune to the infection of bias. I was the captain of the debate team. I held a 4.2 GPA, weighted. I was the student who stayed after class to help stack chairs. I had curated a persona of non-threatening intellectualism, a suit of armor woven from report cards and commendations. I believed, in that quiet moment before he spoke, that my resume would serve as my witness. I believed that facts still mattered in a room designed to enforce feelings. Skinner began to read, his voice devoid of inflection. Mr. Henderson reports that during third period AP History, you engaged in disruptive and threatening behavior. He claims that when asked to take your seat, you assumed an aggressive posture and used a tone that made him fear for his physical safety. Skinner looked up over the rim of his glasses. I waited for the punchline. I waited for him to laugh and say there must be some mistake. Mr. Henderson was a former linebacker who stood 6'3" and weighed at least 240 pounds. I was 17, a $150 soaking wet, and wearing a sweater vest. The physics of the accusation were impossible. The geometry of the threat did not exist. But Skinner did not laugh. He looked at me with a weary expectation, waiting for me to crack, to get loud, to give him the excuse he needed to validate the paperwork in his hand. I took a breath, measuring it carefully. I engaged the defense of excellence. I spoke slowly, enunciating every syllable, ensuring that my diction was crisp enough to cut glass. "Principal Skinner," I said, keeping my voice in the lower register, calm and flat. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding regarding the definition of the word threatening. I did not raise my voice. I did not leave my assigned area. I simply asked Mr. Henderson to clarify why my essay on the Reconstruction era was marked down a full letter grade despite meeting every criterion on the rubric. I pointed out that his comments on the paper contradicted the source material we were provided. Is asking for academic clarity now considered a physical threat?" Mr. Henderson scoffed. It was a sharp, ugly sound. "See," he said, pointing a finger at me without making eye contact. "That right there. The arrogance. He thinks he can lawyer his way out of this. He thinks because he uses big words he can disrespect authority. He walked up on me, Skinner. He got right in my personal space. I felt unsafe. The word unsafe hung in the air like smoke. It was a weaponized word. In the modern educational landscape, claiming you feel unsafe is the ultimate trump card. It bypasses logic and goes straight to policy. It turns a conversation into a crisis. I looked at Henderson, really looked at him, and I realized the trap I was in. My excellence was not my shield. My excellence was the provocation. To a man like Henderson, who was used to compliance and mediocrity, a young black man who knew the material better than he did was not a student to be nurtured. I was an insurrection. Skinner sighed and leaned back, the leather chair groaning in sympathy. "Listen, son," he said, using that patronizing term that always made my skin crawl. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for intimidation. Mr. Henderson is a respected member of this faculty. If he says he felt threatened, we have to take that seriously. Your grades are good, I see that. But intelligence is not a license for insubordination. We need to talk about your attitude. You walk around these halls like you own the place. You challenge teachers in front of other students. It creates a hostile environment." I felt the walls of the room closing in. This was the gaslight. The defense of excellence was crumbling because the currency I was paying withheld no value in this economy. I had thought that if I followed the rules better than anyone else, the rules would protect me. I had thought that if I mastered their language, they would have to listen to me. But I was learning a painful lesson in that lemon-scented office. When you are the other, competence is interpreted as combativeness. Silence is interpreted as sullenness. And existence is interpreted as aggression. I thought about the hours I spent studying until my eyes burned. I thought about the weekends I sacrificed for extra credit projects. I thought about the way I practiced my smile in the mirror, making sure it wasn't too wide, wasn't too toothy, just pleasant enough to be disarming. All of that labor, all of that meticulous construction of self, was being dismantled by a man who was insecure about his own authority. I decided to try one more time. I decided to appeal to the record. "Principal Skinner," I said, maintaining my composure despite the heart hammering against my ribs. "I have never had a disciplinary infraction in 3 years. I have never been sent to this office. I have never been in a fight. Does my history count for nothing? Does the character I have demonstrated every single day since I stepped foot in this high school hold less weight than one man's subjective interpretation of my tone? I am asking you to look at the evidence of who I am, not the caricature that is being painted of me." Skinner looked at the file. He flipped a page. He tapped his pen on the desk. For a second, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt. I thought perhaps the logic was penetrating the fog of bureaucratic solidarity. But then he looked at Henderson, and Henderson gave him a look. It was a look of brotherhood, of the closed ranks. It was the silent communication of the system protecting itself. Skinner closed the folder. "The problem," he said, his voice hardening, is that smart kids often think they can get away with things. Maybe you've just been good at hiding it until now. Maybe Mr. Henderson is the first one to call you out on it. We're going to have to suspend you pending an investigation. 3 days. Out of school. And you'll need to write a letter of apology to Mr. Henderson before you. He wanted me to sign a confession for a crime I didn't commit to soothe the ego of a man who was threatened by my intellect. This was the breaking point. This was where the defense of excellence died and something else had to be born. I realized then that I couldn't win this by playing their game. I couldn't win by being the model student. The model student was getting suspended. The model student was being called a thug in polite language. I needed a different strategy. I needed a witness that didn't have a bias. I needed an eye that didn't blink and didn't judge based on the color of my skin. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. Henderson flinched, expecting the violence he had hallucinated. I saw the fear in his eyes, and for the first time, I understood it. He wasn't afraid I would hit him. He was afraid because he knew, deep down, that he was wrong, and he was afraid that I had the power to expose it. I looked at Skinner. I will not be writing that letter, I said. And I will not be accepting this suspension without a hearing. Skinner blinked, surprised by the sudden steel in my voice. Is that so? He asked. And what makes you think you have a choice? I didn't answer him immediately. I turned my head slightly, looking through the glass partition of his office, out into the main reception area, and beyond that, through the open double doors into the hallway. High up on the wall, nestled in the corner of the ceiling, was a small, black dome. A blinking red light pulsed rhythmically, a digital heartbeat recording the truth in high definition. The defense of excellence had failed, but the receipts were eternal. I looked back at Skinner and allowed myself a very small, very cold smile. Because, I said, simply, I know what really happened. And I know that the camera in the hallway has a wide-angle lens. It captures the doorway to Mr. Henderson's classroom. It captures everything. The room went silent. The kind of silence that happens when the air pressure drops before a storm. Skinner's eyes darted to the hallway. Henderson's face lost its flush and went a pale, sickly gray. I had played my hand. I had abandoned the plea for mercy and reached for the sword of truth. The defense of excellence was over. The era of the receipt had begun. But before we could look at the footage, before the vindication, I had to survive the immediate aftermath of my declaration. I had to endure the shift in the room, where the predator realizes the prey has teeth. I sat back down, folded my arms, and waited. The game had not just begun. The game had just changed rules entirely. Dust motes danced in the shaft of afternoon sunlight that cut across the mahogany desk, indifferent to the silent war being waged beneath them. The air in Principal Skinner's office had grown heavy, thick with the unsaid implications of my challenge regarding the hallway camera. Henderson was no longer leaning forward in that aggressive, predatory stance he had adopted when I first walked in. He had slumped back into the leather chair, his jacket bunching awkwardly around his shoulders, his face a map of sudden, frantic calculation. He was running the mental simulation of the last hour, trying to remember exactly where he had stood, exactly how close he had gotten to my face, and exactly what the lens of that camera would have seen. It was a delicious moment of hesitation, but I knew better than to smile. Smiling in a moment of victory is interpreted as arrogance when you look like me. It is interpreted as a threat. So I engaged the mechanism that every black boy in America receives along with his birth certificate. I reached into the control panel of my own psyche and I found the internal volume knob. This is not a physical dial, of course, but the sensation is just as tactile. It is a deliberate, conscious recalibration of one's entire existence. It starts in the chest. You feel the heat rising, the righteous indignation, the urge to shout down the lie. That is the signal. That is the red zone on the audio mixer. If you let that signal peak, if you let the audio clip, you lose the audience. You become the noise. You become the stereotype they have already written on the police report in their minds. So you grab that fader and you pull it down. You relax the muscles in your neck until they feel unnatural. You unclench the jaw that wants to snap shut. You modulate the pitch of your voice, stripping away the bass, stripping away the edge, leaving only a flat, sterile frequency that cannot be sampled for a remix of aggression. I watched Henderson's eyes dart toward Skinner, and I lowered my internal volume to a safe, non-threatening 3 out of 10. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, the sound wet and nervous in the quiet room. He was trying to find a pivot. He knew the camera footage would exonerate me from the physical threat, so he had to move the goalposts. This is the second phase of the attack. If they cannot prove you did something wrong, they will argue that you felt wrong. They will police your tone. They will police your eyes. They will indict your spirit. Henderson pointed a shaking finger at me, but he looked at the principal. He said that regardless of the hallway, my behavior inside the classroom had been insubordinate. He claimed there was a menacing quality to my silence, a disrespect in the way I sat. He was grasping at smoke, trying to build a cage out of shadows. He was trying to provoke a reaction that would justify his initial fear. He needed me to get angry. He needed me to raise my voice so he could point and say, "See, there it is. There is the danger I told you about." I did not give him what he wanted. I remembered the Saturday morning lesson in the driveway with my father. I was 16, barely licensed, sitting behind the wheel of his sedate gray sedan. The engine was off. We were not going anywhere. He was teaching me how to be pulled over. He told me that my hands had to be at 10 and 2, visible at all times. He told me that my movements had to be slow, like I was moving through water. But most importantly, he taught me about the voice. He said that I had to speak with a specific cadence. Polite, but not subservient. Clear, but not loud. He called it the frequency of survival. He said that some people are deaf to our innocence, so we have to broadcast on a frequency that bypasses their bias. We have to sound like their neighbors. We have to sound like their doctors. We have to sound like people who have lawyers. That lesson in the driveway was about surviving a traffic stop, but it applied to every interaction with authority. It was the user manual for the volume knob. I brought that memory into the office. I looked at Principal Skinner, ignoring Henderson entirely. I kept my hands folded in my lap, palms open, the universal sign of having nothing to hide. I spoke softly, forcing them to lean in to hear me. This is a power move disguised as submission. When you lower your voice, you force the room to quiet down to meet you. I told the principal that I was confused. I said that I had entered the classroom, taken my seat, and opened my book. I said that I had not spoken until Mr. Henderson addressed me. I asked, with genuine manufactured curiosity, what specific action I had taken that was interpreted as a threat. I used words like interpreted and specific. I used the vocabulary of the handbook. I was code switching, yes, but it was more than that. I was holding up a mirror. By remaining perfectly calm, perfectly articulate, and perfectly still, I was making Mr. Henderson's agitation look irrational. The contrast was the weapon. Skinner looked between us. He was a man who valued order above all else. He disliked disruption. Usually, the disruption came from the student. The student would be shouting, denying, crying, making a scene. That was the script. Skinner knew how to handle that script. He would play the firm disciplinarian, the calm voice of reason against the chaotic teenager. But the script had been flipped. I was the calm one. I was the one referencing evidence. I was the one de-escalating the situation. Henderson was the one with the red face, the high-pitched voice, the sweating brow. Henderson was the one introducing chaos into Skinner's orderly afternoon. I watched the realization dawn on the principal's face. He was looking at his longtime colleague and seeing, perhaps for the first time, a liability. He was seeing a man who had lost control of his classroom and was now trying to use the administration to cover his tracks. But the volume knob takes a toll. That is the part of the story they do not tell you in the diversity seminars. They tell you to be professional. They tell you to have grit. They do not tell you that suppressing your natural fight-or-flight response causes a buildup of toxic energy in the blood. It is physically painful to sit still when someone is lying about you. It is a biological violation to lower your voice when every instinct is screaming to defend your name. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I kept my breathing even. I focused on the texture of the chair arm under my wrist. I focused on the ticking of the clock. I maintained the mask. This is the emotional tax we pay. We pay it in blood pressure. We pay it in stress. We pay it in the exhaustion that hits us the moment we walk out the door and are finally allowed to be human again. Mr. Henderson tried one last gambit. He realized the insubordination angle was not landing, so he tried to play the victim. He softened his own voice, trying to mimic my control, but he lacked the practice. It came off as whining. He said that he felt unsafe. He used that word specifically. Unsafe. It is a powerful word in education. It triggers protocols. It triggers zero-tolerance policies. He said that the way I looked at him made him feel unsafe. It was a fascinating admission. He was admitting that my existence, my gaze, my very presence was the source of his fear, not my actions. He was admitting that the threat was internal to him, not external from me. But he phrased it as an accusation. He wanted Skinner to validate his fear. He wanted the system to agree that a black boy looking a white man in the eye is an act of aggression. I turned the volume knob down another notch. I became almost statue-like. I waited for Skinner to respond. The silence stretched out, thin and taut. Skinner picked up a pen and tapped it against the desk. Tap, tap, tap. He was thinking about the camera. He was thinking about the lawsuit that would inevitably follow if he expelled a student for looking at a teacher, especially if video evidence showed that student sitting quietly. The logic of the pillars was holding. The defense of excellence had established my character. The hallway camera had established the objective reality. And now, the internal volume knob was establishing my emotional stability while highlighting Henderson's instability. I had stripped them of their excuses. I had removed the fog of war. Skinner finally stopped tapping the pen. He looked at Henderson, and his expression was cold. It was not the look of a friend. It was the look of a manager dealing with a problem employee. He told Mr. Henderson that feelings of safety were subjective, but disciplinary action required objective breaches of the code of conduct. He said that without an overt act of aggression, without a verbal threat, and with the existence of video evidence that we were about to review, the claim of threatening behavior was currently unsubstantiated. The word hung in the air. Unsubstantiated. It was a polite way of saying unproven. It was a polite way of saying lie. Henderson recoiled as if he had been slapped. He opened his mouth to argue, but Skinner cut him off with a raised hand. The principal stood up. The movement was final. He said that we were going to the security office. We were going to watch the tape. He said it not as a question, but as a command. He wanted to see the truth with his own eyes. I stood up as well. I moved slowly. I smoothed the front of my shirt. I did not look at Henderson. The fluorescent hum of the corridor seemed to vibrate against the base of my skull as we made the long walk toward the security office. Every squeak of Mr. Henderson's loafers on the linoleum sounded like a desperate plea for validation. He walked with a choppy, aggressive gait, while Principal Miller moved with the reluctant heaviness of a man who suspects he has bet on the wrong horse. I walked 5 paces behind them. This spacing was deliberate. It was not the lag of a prisoner being led to a cell, but the measured distance of an observer studying a specimen. As I watched Henderson's rigid shoulders, the sterile white walls of the school dissolved. The smell of floor wax and locker room sweat faded, replaced by the scent of cedar shavings, pipe tobacco, and old, leather-bound books. The hallway disappeared, and I was 8 years old again, sitting in the high-backed wing chair in my grandfather's study. This was the sanctuary where the real curriculum was taught, the lessons that no public school textbook would ever dare to print. My grandfather, Mr. Arthur Davis, did not believe in chance. He believed in preparation. He was a man who had worn a three-piece suit to pick cotton in 1948, just to prove that his dignity was not subject to his employment. He sat across from me in that memory, his silhouette framed by the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. He held a glass of sweet tea that never seemed to sweat, his hands steady and dark like polished mahogany. He was the architect of the armor I was wearing today. I realized then that Henderson had no idea who he was fighting. He thought he was grappling with a 17-year-old boy named Marcus. He did not know he was in a ring with Arthur Davis and the ghosts of 1968. In that study, surrounded by encyclopedias and framed photographs of men in fedoras marching down angry streets, my grandfather had taught me the physics of racial optics. He called it the discipline of the counter-narrative. He would place a chessboard between us, but we never played chess. We played scenarios. He would lean forward, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, and say that when you are a black man in America, you are never just entering a room. You are entering a presumption of guilt. He told me that my silence would always be read as defiance, and my intelligence would be read as arrogance. Therefore, I had to master a third language. It was not English, and it was not slang. It was the language of immovable calm. He told me about the spring of 1968, the year he helped organize a sanitation strike in the city. He described the screaming faces of the counter-protesters, the way their veins bulged, the way spittle flew from their mouths like venom. He told me how much he wanted to raise his fist. He told me how his muscles ached with the desire to strike back, to let the fire in his belly incinerate the hate in front of him. But he didn't. He stood in his Sunday best, his hands clasped behind his back, his chin tilted exactly 10 degrees upward. He told me that violence is what they expect. It is the narrative they have written for you. When you give them violence, or even just loud anger, you are signing the contract they drafted. You are playing the role of the brute. But when you give them silence, when you give them impeccable manners and terrifying stillness, you break their machine. You become a glitch in their programming. He taught me that the most dangerous thing a black man can hold is not a weapon, but his own composure. I remembered the day he made me practice walking into a room where I was not wanted. He made me do it 10 times. The first time, I looked down at my feet. He told me to start over. The second time, I looked too aggressive, my jaw tight. He told me to start over. He made me walk until I moved like water, fluid and inevitable. He taught me how to unclench my fists when my heart was racing. He taught me to lower my voice when the other person raised theirs. He called it the volume inversion. The louder they get, the softer you become. This forces them to lean in to hear you, and in that moment, the power dynamic shifts. They are chasing your words, you are not chasing their approval. As we continued down the school hallway, approaching the double doors of the administrative wing, I looked at Henderson's back again. He was agitated. His hands were opening and closing at his sides. He was vibrating with the chaotic energy of a man who needs a conflict to justify his existence. He was the mob in 1968. He was the screaming face. He was the one who had lost control. I felt a sudden, strange wave of pity for him. He had the authority, the title, and the race card that usually won the hand, but he had zero discipline. He was fighting on instinct, while I was fighting on heritage. My grandfather had prepared me for this exact Tuesday afternoon before I was even born. The training was in my DNA. I remembered the specific photograph my grandfather kept on his desk. It was black and white, grainy, showing a line of men standing in front of a segregated lunch counter. They were being poured on, shouted at, humiliated. But their faces were serene. They looked like statues carved from obsidian. My grandfather would point to that picture and tell me to look at their eyes. He said that they were not looking at the food they were denied. They were looking at the future. They were looking at me. He told me that their stoicism was a bank deposit, a savings account of dignity that they were building for their grandchildren. He said that one day, I would need to make a withdrawal. Today was that day. I breathed in deeply, filling my lungs with the stale air of the school, but tasting the pipe tobacco of that study. I straightened my spine, feeling the phantom adjustment of my grandfather's hand on my back, correcting my posture. The pillar of the mentor is not just about having a teacher, it is about realizing that you are the continuation of a long, quiet war. Henderson thought he had caught a student acting out. He didn't realize he had walked into a trap set 50 years ago. The intergenerational link is the secret weapon. It is the knowledge that my survival is not a lucky accident, but a carefully engineered project. I am the return on investment for every insult my grandfather swallowed, for every door that was slammed in his face, for every time he chose to be strategic rather than emotional. I adjusted my cuffs. I checked the knot of my tie in the reflection of a trophy case we passed. I was ready. We reached the door to the security office. Principal Miller swiped his key card. The light turned green with a mechanical beep. Miller held the door open, his eyes avoiding mine. Henderson brushed past him, eager to see the footage, eager to see the confirmation of his bias. He wanted to see a monster. He wanted to see a threat. He was about to see the meticulous work of Arthur Davis. I stepped across the threshold, bringing the sanctuary with me, bringing the silence of the library, bringing the stillness of the men in the photograph. The room was cool and smelled of ozone and electronics. A bank of monitors hummed on the wall. The security guard, a heavy-set man named Ortiz, swiveled in his chair, looking surprised to see the high command invading his cave. Henderson pointed a shaking finger at the monitor. He demanded the tape from 2:15 p.m., the second floor, East Wing. He sounded triumphant, like a hunter standing over a trap. I stood by the door, clasping my hands behind my back, chin tilted 10 degrees upward. I waited. The lesson was complete. Now came the exam. The air in the security office was recycled and tasted of stale coffee and warmed plastic. It was a windowless cave tucked behind the cafeteria, a place where the school administration usually reviewed minor thefts or fights behind the bleachers. Today, it was a courtroom. The walls were lined with metal shelves stacked with binders, but the focal point was the wall of monitors, a grid of gray and white eyes watching the empty corridors. Ortiz, the security guard, looked uncomfortable. He sensed the gravity of the moment, the way the principal stood with his arms crossed tight against his chest, the way Mr. Henderson breathed in short, shallow gasps, and the way I stood, motionless, hands clasped behind my back, embodying the discipline of Arthur Davis. Ortiz typed a command into the keyboard. The largest monitor in the center of the bank flickered. Static washed over the screen for a second, a digital snowstorm clearing to reveal the second-floor hallway. The timestamp in the corner read 2:14 p.m. We were watching the past. We were about to see the ghost. Henderson leaned forward, his finger stabbing at the glass. He told the principal to watch closely. He said I had lunged. He said I had balled my fists. He said the look in my eyes was primal, something dangerous, something that required him to defend the sanctity of his classroom. He was building a narrative in real time, trying to overlay his audio commentary onto the silent film playing before us. The principal said nothing. He just watched. On the screen, the hallway was empty for a moment, a long tunnel of linoleum and lockers. Then, the door to room 302 opened. The digital version of Henderson stepped out. Even in the grainy, low-resolution footage, his agitation was visible. He was pacing, gesturing wildly at the empty air, his body language jagged and erratic. He looked like a man fighting a swarm of bees. Then, the digital version of me stepped into the frame. The contrast was so sharp it felt like it had been scripted by a playwright. The figure of Henderson was a blur of motion, arms flailing, head snapping back and forth. The figure of me was architectural. I moved with a slow, deliberate cadence. I did not rush. I did not slouch. I carried my books in my left arm, pressed against my chest, a shield of knowledge. My right arm was at my side, relaxed. I stopped exactly 3 feet from him. The distance was respectful. It was precise. In the security room, the silence grew heavy. The Henderson standing next to me began to mutter, but his voice lacked conviction. He was seeing himself from the outside for the first time, and the reflection was not flattering. The camera did not capture the words we spoke, but it captured the physics of the encounter. It captured the energy. And the energy coming from the teacher was chaotic, while the energy coming from the student was absolute zero. We watched the moment of the alleged assault. On the screen, Henderson pointed a finger in my face. He invaded the 3-foot radius. He was shouting. You could see the strain in his neck muscles, the way his jaw worked. The digital me did not flinch. I did not step back, for that would have shown fear, and I did not step forward, for that would have shown aggression. I simply stood. I was a statue of dignity amidst a storm of insecurity. Then came the climax. Henderson claimed I had made a threatening gesture. On the screen, I slowly raised my right hand. Henderson flinched violently, stumbling back against the lockers as if struck by a physical blow. But the tape showed the truth. My hand had moved at the speed of a drifting cloud. It held a hall pass. I was offering him the documentation he had demanded. I held it out, steady and unwavering. He had recoiled not from a fist, but from a slip of paper. He had recoiled because he expected violence. He had projected a monster onto a boy, and when the boy refused to be a monster, the cognitive dissonance made him stumble. The principal let out a long, slow exhale. It was the sound of a balloon deflating. He reached out and touched Ortiz on the shoulder, signaling him to pause the video. The image froze. There it was. The undeniable receipt. The teacher, pressed against the lockers in a posture of terrified defense. The student, standing tall, extending a piece of paper with the grace of a diplomat. The visual evidence stripped away the adjectives Henderson had used. There was no savagery. There was no thug-like behavior. There was only a professional losing his composure in front of a child who had mastered his. The principal turned to Henderson. The look on his face was not anger, which might have been bearable. It was pity. It was a profound, exhausting disappointment. He asked Henderson to explain what, exactly, was threatening about a student handing over a hall pass. Henderson stammered. He tried to reclaim the narrative. He spoke about micro-expressions, about the tone of voice that the camera couldn't record, about the atmosphere of intimidation I had projected. He was drowning, and he was grasping at straws that weren't there. He looked at me, hoping to find a smirk, a sign of arrogance that he could point to and say, See how he looks at me. But I gave him nothing. I maintained the Davis stance. I looked at him with a neutral, polite expression. I was not there to mock him. I was there to witness the truth. My silence was the final nail in the coffin of his lie. By refusing to engage in his emotional chaos, I highlighted it. By refusing to be the angry black boy he needed me to be to justify his fear, I forced him to own that fear. The threat wasn't me. The threat was inside him. The principal turned to me. His voice was softer now, stripped of the administrative edge it held earlier. He apologized. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He used words like misinterpretation and stress. He was trying to build a soft landing for his teacher, trying to save face for the institution. But the footage was still frozen on the screen, a mural of truth that could not be talked away. I accepted his apology with a nod. I did not demand Henderson's resignation. I did not scream for justice. To do so would have been to lower myself to the level of the chaos I had just exposed. I simply asked if I was free to return to my education. The principal nodded. He looked at the door, almost eager for me to leave, eager to be alone with his employee so he could handle the mess without the mirror standing there watching them. I walked out of the security office. The hallway outside was bright, illuminated by the afternoon sun streaming through the high windows. The contrast was blinding. I felt the tension in my shoulders finally begin to dissolve, the armor I had worn for the last hour slowly retracting. I had won. But as I walked back toward the library, the victory tasted metallic. I realized the price of that win. To survive, to prove I was not a threat, I had to suppress every natural human reaction. I couldn't get angry at being falsely accused. The heavy double doors of the gymnasium swung shut behind me, muting the roar of applause and the squeak of dress shoes on varnished wood, leaving me alone in the sudden silence of the corridor. It was the same hallway. The same linoleum tiles, scuffed by generations of sneakers, stretched out in a long, converging perspective line toward the exit. But the air felt different now, thinner, less pressurized. I walked slowly, the graduation gown rustling around my ankles like a whisper. I stopped exactly where it had happened. I looked up. The black dome of the security camera was still there, a silent, unblinking sentinel mounted in the corner of the ceiling. It looked innocuous, just a piece of plastic and glass, yet it held the power of an oracle. It had seen what human eyes refused to see. It had been the difference between a criminal record and a diploma. But standing there, holding the leather-bound folder that certified my intelligence, I felt a profound sense of exhaustion settle into my marrow. This was the final lesson, the one that isn't written in any syllabus but is carved into the psyche of every student who has had to defend their right to exist in a space that views them with suspicion. I realized then that the camera had not saved my innocence. It had merely preserved my future. The innocence was gone the moment I realized I had to calculate the trajectory of my hand gestures to avoid being labeled a threat. I looked at the spot on the wall where Mrs. H used to stand, where she had folded her arms and accused me of aggression simply because I existed with confidence. She was gone now. The administration had quietly removed her, a bureaucratic erasure that masqueraded as justice. There was no public apology, no assembly to correct the record. Just a quiet exit, a disappearing act, ensuring the institution's reputation remained unblemished. That is how these battles often end. Not with a bang, not with a triumphant fanfare, but with the quiet shuffling of papers and the closing of doors. The victory I had secured was the right to walk away. I pushed through the exit doors and stepped out into the humid embrace of the late afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. My parents were waiting by the car, their faces glowing with a pride that was fierce and protective. My father adjusted his tie, a mirror of the one I wore. He didn't smile with his mouth, but his eyes were shining. He knew. He knew the weight of the invisible backpack I had been carrying. He knew that today wasn't just about academic achievement, it was about survival. We didn't speak about the incident. We rarely did anymore. It had become a piece of family lore, a scar that we acknowledged but didn't touch. But then I saw him. Mr. Davis was standing near the edge of the parking lot, leaning against the hood of his vintage sedan, a silhouette against the setting sun. He wasn't wearing his janitorial uniform. He was in a suit, charcoal gray, impeccably pressed, a fedora resting on the roof of the car beside him. He looked like the photograph in the library come to life, a man from a different era, transported to this moment to witness the closing of the circle. I excused myself from my parents and walked over to him. The gravel crunched under my polished shoes, a sound that felt loud in the suspended quiet of the evening. Mr. Davis didn't move as I approached. He watched me with that same steady, assessing gaze he had used in the utility closet when he first taught me how to stand. When I stopped a few feet away, he nodded, a slow, deliberate lowering of his chin. "You made it," he said. His voice was gravel and honey, deep with the rhythms of history. I held up the diploma. "I made it," I replied. "But it feels heavy." Mr. Davis pushed himself off the car and took a step toward me. He reached out and tapped the leather folder. "The paper is light," he said. "The history is heavy. You are not just carrying your own grades in there, son. You are carrying the proof that their narrative failed. That is a heavy thing to carry." We stood there for a moment, two generations of men who had learned to navigate a world that often preferred their silence. Mr. Davis looked toward the school building, the brick fortress that was now just a backdrop. "You learned the lesson," he said softly. I asked him which one. He smiled, a rare, breaking expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You learned that the truth is not enough. You need the receipts. You need the camera. You need the composure. But most importantly, you learned that your dignity is not something they give you. It is something you keep. They tried to take it. They failed. That is the only grade that matters. He extended his hand. I took it. His grip was firm, calloused, the hand of a man who had worked hard so that I could work smart. In that handshake, there was a transfer of energy, a passing of the baton. He was releasing me. The mentorship was over because the apprenticeship was done. I was a journeyman now, heading out into a world that would present new versions of Mrs. H, new hallways, new accusations. But I had the toolkit. I had the armor. As I walked back to my parents' car, I thought about the concept of the receipts one last time. In the modern world, we are obsessed with proof. We screen record conversations, we save emails, we rely on surveillance to validate our reality. And thank God for it. Without that hallway camera, my word would have been crushed under the weight of her authority. But the counterstory is this: we should not have to live life as if we are building a legal case. The tragedy of the black tax is the energy spent on defense. The cognitive load of constantly monitoring how you are perceived, of ensuring your tone is modulated, your hands are visible, your dissent is respectful. It is a second full-time job. I slid into the back seat of my father's car and tossed the graduation cap onto the seat beside me. I loosened my tie. I slid into the back seat of my father's car and tossed the graduation cap onto the seat beside me. I loosened my tie. The fabric had felt like a noose for months, a symbol of the constriction I had accepted as the price of admission. Now, unbuttoning the top button, I felt the first true breath of air fill my lungs. The engine started, a low hum that vibrated through the chassis. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I watched the school recede in the rearview mirror. It got smaller and smaller until it was just a block of red brick, indistinguishable from any other building. The camera was left behind. The hallway was left behind. The files, the accusations, the hearings, all of it was shrinking into the past. But the lesson remained. I understood now that the ultimate rebellion wasn't shouting or fighting back with aggression. The ultimate rebellion was excellence. It was precision. It was being so undeniably correct in your conduct and your capabilities that their prejudice had no jagged edge to catch onto. It was a cold, hard way to live, perhaps. It lacked the carefree abandon of a childhood where mistakes are just mistakes and not indictments of character. But it was a way to survive. And more than that, it was a way to win. I looked out the window at the passing telephone poles, keeping time like a metronome. I was not bitter. Bitterness is a poison you drink expecting the other person to die. I was clear-eyed. I had seen the machinery of the institution, the gears and levers that move to protect power. I had thrown a wrench in those gears, not with a closed fist, but with an open palm and a video file. I had forced the system to work as it was theoretically designed to, rather than how it usually functions. That was the legacy of this year. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the streetlights flickered on, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the road. I closed my eyes. The narrative was mine now. They had tried to write a story about a threatening student, a stereotype, a statistic. I had taken the pen out of their hands and written a different ending. I was not the villain. I was not the victim. I was the author. And as the car accelerated onto the highway, merging into the stream of lights flowing toward the city, I knew that the story was just beginning. The hallway was over. The world was waiting. And I was ready.